What happens when an engineer accustomed to building dams decides to get involved with the Navy? The command ridiculed his drawings, but a few weeks later, the ships built according to them began returning home. You ever watch a man with 2 degrees and 3 decades of dirt on his hands get told he's not qualified to think? Not fight, not shoot, not march. Think. That's what they told me. My name's Clyde Reeves, and before this war put me in uniform, I built things. Big things. Things that held back rivers and lit up towns. But none of that meant a damn when I walked into that army office in 1942 and laid down an idea that could have saved lives. Hell, maybe more than a few. I didn't come in swinging. I wasn't one of those loud mouths with a chip on his shoulder and no plan. No, I came in holding a damn blueprint, sketched out on ration paper with calculations written by hand, ink still drying. It wasn't fancy, but it made sense. And what did I get for it? Not your place, Reeves. That's what they said. You build dams, you don't build ships. Stick to what you know. The mud was always louder than the men. We were stationed at Norfolk, the part they don't put in the brochures. Sand, rust, shouting, and more mud than a Mississippi levee in March. There were dock workers and engineers, cargo boys and crane crews, all of us packed into a logistical nightmare. Every day, I saw steel crates dropped the wrong way, fuel barrels leaking into the bay, and kids, loading ammunition like it was groceries. I didn't complain. I came here to help, so I built. I built ramps and reinforced launch angles. I fixed drainage in less time than it took the brass to finish a meeting. I made their supply line run 2 hours faster. And then I noticed the real problem. See, it didn't matter how fast we loaded. It didn't matter how much we packed. The ships kept going down, convoy after convoy. German U-boats were slicing through the Atlantic like it was a butcher's shop. Every week, another letter got folded. Another widow got a telegram, and no one wanted to admit the truth. We weren't adapting. Same old cargo holds, same old drop methods, same old belief that if it worked in the last war, it'll work in this one. The blueprint that got me slapped. So I spent a weekend in the back of the hangar, drafting something different. Not a new battleship. I ain't no admiral. A modular barge system. Floating supply units reinforced on the sides, designed to split and reconnect. Simple idea. If they hit one module, the rest don't go down. If they miss the rendezvous, the cargo keeps floating. And if the port's too hot, drop them offshore and use a flat tow to pull them in later. It wasn't science fiction. It was common sense. We had the steel. We had the welders. Hell, we had the need. So I wrote it up and brought it to the base engineers. They laughed. You think you're better than the Navy now? That was Macaulay, 50 years old, red-nosed and angry that I wore boots instead of stripes. We've been building these ships the same way for 20 years. Who are you to rewrite the book? I said nothing, because I'd already seen what happened to men who argued with officers like him. They didn't win. They got buried under paperwork. Or worse, reassigned to Alaska to count snowflakes. The sit-down that didn't sit right. 3 days later, I was called into the commander's office. Carpet thicker than our winter blankets, maps all over the walls. And behind the desk, Colonel Harmon, one of those polished types. Clean buttons, smiled like a fox. He didn't even look up at first, just tapped my file and said, "Reeves, you built the lower segment of the Blackwater Dam, right?" I nodded. Hell of a project. I read about it in Engineering Monthly. That gave me a flicker of hope. A small one. Then he leaned back and gave me the line. "So why are you trying to be something you're not?" Just like that. Gone was the compliment. Gone was the respect. All that was left was the wall. Just a builder. Watch me. I could feel the heat in my palms. Not anger, shame. Because for a second I believed him. I looked down at my uniform, covered in dust and grease. I remembered the dam back home, the one they still used to power half a county. I remembered working 18-hour shifts, hammering steel into concrete, building things that lasted. And now I was being told I didn't belong. Not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't them. I didn't have the right title. I didn't come from the academy. I wasn't part of the circle. Just a builder. Just a colored builder in a war run by white collars and closed doors. The quiet. After the door closed, I walked out of that office slower than I came in. No one said a word, but I could feel the eyes. Some of the boys looked at me with pity, some with relief. "Glad it ain't me," their faces said, but one man stopped me on the steps. Private Daniels, black kid, southern drawl, wore his uniform like a borrowed coat. He said, "Sir, I saw those sketches. That's smart, real smart." And then he added, "They don't want smart. They want the same." That line stuck with me, still does, because that's what it was. Not fear, laziness, arrogance, tradition dressed up in stripes. They weren't just fighting Germany. They were fighting change. We're just getting started with this story. But trust me, it only gets more intense from here. Stick around to see what happens when the system hits back even harder. Let me tell you what happens when a man keeps pushing the system after they've already told him no. They stop trying to argue. They start trying to erase you. Not with bullets, not with fists, but with paperwork, transfers, silence, the kind that doesn't make noise, but makes sure no one hears from you again. It started 2 days after that little chat with Colonel Harmon. I was still on base in Norfolk, still in the mud, still trying to keep the cranes from toppling every time a load shifted wrong. But something had changed. Folks who used to nod at me, now they looked the other way. Messages stopped coming through. Requests got misplaced. Even my supply log was flagged for redundant reporting. That's how it works. They don't hit you. They drain you. The man with the clipboard. The first real hit came with a knock on my barracks door. Middle of the afternoon, sun like syrup on your skin. And there he was, a man with a clipboard and a face like week-old bread. "Orders, Reeves. You're being transferred. Tomorrow morning." I blinked. Transferred where? Temporary assignment, logistics inspection, down in Charleston. He didn't wait for questions. Didn't even look me in the eye. Just handed me the paper and walked off like it was laundry day. Now, let me explain something. When they say temporary logistics, they don't mean a promotion. They mean we don't want you where people can hear you. They mean you talk too much, and now you're going to talk to walls. The freight yard. Nobody wanted. So the next morning I'm on a troop truck, bouncing down a dirt road to a place that looked like it was built for forgetting. Charleston Freight Depot 17. Out of the way, out of the loop. No ships, no cranes. Just rusted rails, broken pallets, and a whole lot of men who looked like they hadn't seen a functioning wrench in weeks. "What exactly am I supposed to do here?" I asked the sergeant on duty. He shrugged. "Whatever they tell you, or nothing at all. You ever walk into a room where everyone's been told not to speak to you? That was Depot 17. They didn't ask my name, didn't care about my experience. To them, I was just another problem that had been shipped off in a crate. Barrels, boots, and broken men. So I worked. I cataloged. I fixed busted loading arms. I redrew a storage layout that shaved 6 hours off load time. Not that anyone noticed. I even found a way to repurpose flood-damaged barrels as floatable fuel drums. And that's where I met Eddie Monroe. Black kid, maybe 19, skinny as a fence post, but faster than a rat in a thunderstorm. Worked the back lot, smart with his hands, quiet with his mouth. One day he sees me patching together a frame for a rolling drum rack and says, "You an engineer or just stubborn?" I smiled. Both. Eddie stuck around, helped me rebuild half that forgotten yard. No orders, no pay bumps. Just because he saw what I saw, a broken system ain't gonna fix itself. The barrel test that went too well, that's when the idea came. If they won't build my modular barges, fine. But maybe, just maybe, I could prove a piece of it. So we loaded one of those repurposed fuel drums, welded a steel rack on top, attached flotation panels, balanced weight with sandbags. It was rough, ugly, but it held. Next, we filled it with a standard resupply pack, rations, ammo, medicine, and blankets. Rolled it down the old dock ramp and let it float. And damn if it didn't. 36 minutes. Stayed afloat. Didn't leak. Didn't tip. Eddie stared at it like it was magic. That thing could float straight to Europe if they let it. I nodded. They won't, but maybe they'll notice if it floats long enough. Shut it down, Reeves. They noticed all right. 3 days later, a transport officer showed up with 2 MPs and a clipboard. Again with the clipboard. "Is this yours?" he asked, pointing at the floating test barrel tied up to the old dock. "No," I said. "It's ours." He didn't smile. "You are not authorized to initiate or test naval equipment. This depot is not a testing facility." I asked him if maybe he preferred we sit around and polish crates. He didn't like that much. The room with no windows. They didn't throw me in a cell. That would have made too much noise. No, they sat me down in an office with a fan that didn't spin and walls that smelled like old paper. A man in a clean shirt leaned across the desk. "Mr. Reeves, this is the second time you've stepped out of line, first in Norfolk, now here." I kept my face still. I wasn't gonna blink first. "We don't need cowboys. We need order." There it was again. That word. Order. As if order ever won a war, as if sticking to routine ever saved a sinking ship. Silence isn't safety. They let me go. Didn't charge me, didn't promote me either. Just sent me back to the depot like a tool they didn't know how to use. Eddie met me at the gate. Didn't ask questions, just handed me a wrench and nodded toward the busted loader on the far side of the yard. And I went. Because that's what you do when they try to quiet you. You make more noise, but quieter this time, smarter, cleaner. Because if they weren't going to let me fight with fire, I'd use water. We're standing right on the edge now. What comes next will flip the table. Stick around. Chapter 3 is where the real pressure hits. He built dams, but his ships changed the war. If you're interested in how one engineer challenged the army, tradition, and the course of history itself, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. And in the comments, write, do you think he would be ridiculed today too? Or maybe times have changed. You ever been so right it scared people? Not wrong, not reckless, right. And that scared them worse than any mistake ever could. That's what happened the day the flood came. Not from rain, not from storm, but from silence finally breaking. Let me walk you through it. It was a Thursday. Gray light, air thick with salt and smoke from the nearby diesel shed. Depot 17 was running slow, half the crew out sick, other half just pretending to be useful. I was out by the west fence with Eddie, trying to rewire a busted lift crane they said was not worth the fix. "You ever think they send us here just to keep us out the way?" Eddie asked, wiping sweat with his forearm. "They didn't send us here to shine," I said. "They sent us here to rust." And that was the truth. But some metals don't rust easy. The warning that wasn't right around 1 p.m., we heard the horn. Short, sharp, panicked. Now, horns didn't usually mean much around here. Could have been a dock mishap, a dropped crate. Maybe someone took a wrong turn with a forklift. But this one, it didn't stop. And when we looked toward the bay, we saw it. A supply boat coming in crooked, listing hard to port. She wasn't supposed to be here, not this far inland, not this dock. Word came quick, redirected by mistake. U-boat threats pushed her off course. Now limping into our yard with 2 full containers of high-pressure fuel and 24 men on board. Some barely walking. Nobody moved. No orders, no plan. No one in charge. Just a boat full of wounded and a dock that hadn't seen real action in months. When command freezes, builders move. I didn't wait. Didn't ask. Didn't check a manual or wait for approval. I grabbed Eddie. We ran. First, we cleared the dock. Pulled every crate off the lower landing. Told a crew of warehouse boys to drop the paperwork and pick up the damn rope. Then I ran into the tool shack and yanked out the prototype. Yeah, the same float barrel we built and got chewed out for. Except this time it wasn't about testing. This time it was about not letting those boys drown 5 feet from safety. We tied 3 of them together, strapped a hand pump raft to the side, launched it out, fast, ugly. But it moved. Eddie dove in first, pulled 2 men off the slipping edge. I grabbed one by the arm, felt nothing but bone and fatigue. They were half dead already. And I thought, if this dock fails, it won't be the storm that killed them. It'll be the silence before it. The officer who showed up late. Of course, right when the last man was dragged out, and we had fuel drums floating in chains to keep the ship from sliding into the mud. He showed up. Lieutenant Harrow's pressed uniform, clipboard. The kind of man who could talk a full paragraph and say absolutely nothing. "Who authorized this operation?" he snapped, like we'd insulted the paint on his office wall. I pointed at the soaked man on the dock. They did. He didn't smile, didn't thank us, didn't ask if anyone was hurt. All he did was jot something on a page and mutter, "Expect a report request." I looked at Eddie, he looked at me, and we both laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if you don't laugh at moments like that, you go cold. The quiet after courage. That night we sat out by the loading platform, watching the water settle. The men we pulled in, they were sleeping in the infirmary, the barrels, still floating, still holding, and the depot? For once it was quiet, not with fear but with respect. No one said it out loud, but they felt it, and they saw it. That day, a couple of warehouse nobodies had done what protocol wouldn't. Saved lives, stabilized fuel, held the line, with scraps and spit. Not because we were told, because it needed doing. They put my name on a list. 3 days later, I got a letter. Official stationery, signature at the bottom. Said I'd been noted for operational overreach. Not a medal, not a thank you. Just a reminder that I had once again done something they didn't like, even if it worked. That's how I knew I was on the right path. See, if you're fixing things, and they stay quiet, You ain't fixing. You're decorating, but if every time you move they send someone to tell you to stop, you're probably building something real. One step past the line. I didn't stop. I kept refining the idea. Quietly. No memos, no requests. Just work. Eddie helped, so did a few others, folks who never used to speak up but now nodded when they passed me in the yard. We weren't forming a rebellion. We were building a tool. For the next time no one shows up. And I made a promise to myself that night, under that metal roof, with oil on my hands and salt in my shirt. If the system wasn't going to protect its own, then I would. That was the moment everything cracked. The silence broke. The water moved. You've been with me this far, but the next part, that's where the war inside the war really begins. There's a point in every fight where they stop trying to ignore you and start trying to bury you. And I mean that with all the weight behind it. I wasn't a threat because I broke rules. I was a threat because I proved they were wrong, and worse, I did it in front of people. So when the brass came knocking again, it wasn't with warnings this time. It was with a meeting, behind closed doors. No witnesses, just them and me. It started with a box. The thing that triggered it all was a box. A plain wooden crate, marked with a number that didn't match any manifest. I found it half buried behind the north fence, tucked under a tarp like someone had forgotten it on purpose. Inside, spare steel plates, custom cuts, floating frame joints. It wasn't regulation, wasn't part of any scheduled shipment. But I knew exactly what it was. It was the missing set of parts I'd submitted specs for back in Norfolk. Which meant someone had built it. Somewhere, and sent it here. Off the books. I don't know who. I don't know how. But someone out there saw the same need I did, and gave it a quiet green light. The prototype that was never approved. Eddie and I worked on it at night. No fanfare. No noise. Just 2 men and a barrel light. Welding pieces together with hands shaking from caffeine and nerves. 12 days. 14 hours a day. No promises. No backup. And then it floated. Not just floated. It moved. Stable. Balanced. Could be towed. Could survive a hit and still carry weight. We didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. We just looked at each other and knew this was the thing they didn't want to see work. Because if it worked, it proved they waited too long. Then came the invitation. 4 days later, I got a slip. Not an order. An invitation, the kind with an official seal and the kind of language that tries to sound polite but lands like a slap. You are requested to present your recent unauthorized fabrication to the Joint Logistics Review Board, Eastern Command Sector. That wasn't a meeting. That was a trap. They were giving me the rope, expecting I'd hang myself with it. Into the lion's room, the meeting was in a windowless room with polished chairs and polished shoes. Men sitting around a long table, all starch and silence. None of them had calluses. None of them smelled like grease or metal. They were papermen, fluent in reports, allergic to risk. I stood at the end of the room, prototype model sitting in front of me, stripped down for presentation. And for a minute, just a minute, it was quiet, until the one in the center leaned forward and said, "Mr. Reeves, do you understand the consequences of defying chain of command?" I didn't blink. I understand the consequences of ignoring a sinking fleet. A few of them shifted in their seats. One smirked. Another scribbled something. The lead man spoke again. "You've acted outside your authority, constructed equipment using unverified materials, performed field tests without clearance. Do you deny these actions? I shook my head. No, sir. I did them all, and I'd do them again if it meant pulling men out of the water. The tension you could cut with wire. What followed was 20 minutes of passive-aggressive back and forth. They questioned my qualifications. I reminded them I had built more square feet of reinforced infrastructure than anyone in that room. They said it was reckless. I asked how reckless it was to keep sending troops on ships that couldn't float a mile past port. They said it was unauthorized. I asked if common sense required clearance. Each answer built pressure. Each question exposed the thing they feared most. Accountability. Not because they were evil, because they were comfortable, and comfort doesn't like change. The moment I took the room near the end, one of them, younger, maybe a major, asked, "What exactly do you want out of all this, Mr. Reeves?" And I told him straight. I don't want a medal. I don't want a promotion. I want this thing to exist, and I want the men on the water to come home alive. Silence. Not angry silence, not mocking silence, just wait. And in that moment I saw it, not in the lead man, not in the cold ones, but in a few, the ones who looked like they remembered what it meant to build something real. The decision they didn't say out loud. They didn't approve it, they didn't endorse it, but they didn't shut it down either. They told me they'd review options and consider limited field integration pending further assessment. In other words, keep working. Just don't tell us you're working. Walking out with nothing and everything. I walked out of that room without a ribbon, without a handshake, without a nod. But I walked out standing up. And that was enough. Because I knew what they didn't say out loud, that they saw it, that they couldn't unsee it, that the blueprint had made it through the wall. And once a wall cracks, you don't need to knock anymore. That meeting was never reported. But what came out of it? It moved things that were meant to stay still. Stick around, because Chapter 5 is where the cracks start turning into openings. You'd think once you survive a room full of officers trying to chew your hide off, the worst would be over, that folks would shake your hand, or at least stop looking at you like you're contagious. But that ain't how it goes. See, when the system starts cracking, it doesn't come down all at once. It shudders, groans, fights to stay up. Even if it's rotten clear through, and while the brass didn't shut me down, they didn't exactly throw me a parade either. What I got instead was attention, the kind that don't come with cameras, the kind that watches from the corners of a warehouse and whispers behind your back. The new orders that didn't say. Much 3 weeks passed after the meeting. I kept working. No new punishment, no formal change. Then a courier dropped a sealed envelope on my bunk. Standard print. Not addressed personally, just to Logistics Oversight Technician, Sector C. Inside, effective immediately, you are reassigned to Operations Oversight for Convoy Prep Facility. 6A, Wilmington, temporary duty, undisclosed duration. No explanation, no context, just a transfer that smelled like a test. Or a setup. I showed it to Eddie. He looked at me and said what I was already thinking. They're either giving you a shot or trying to bury you somewhere new. I packed my bag. Either way, I wasn't backing down. Welcome to Wilmington, where trust comes. Slow facility. 6A wasn't a port, not exactly. It was a staging yard, set a few miles off the coast, far enough to stay out of sight, close enough to load ships fast. By the time I arrived, it was clear they didn't know what to do with me. The site chief, a wiry man named Parsons, greeted me with a forced half grin and a handshake he didn't mean. "You're the logistics guy from Charleston, right? That's me. Heard you've got ideas. I just smiled. Only the kind that float. He didn't laugh, didn't like that I'd brought my own wrench roll either. The day they tried to box me out from the jump, it was clear I wasn't welcome in the meetings. Every time I walked into a planning room, things got quiet. Every time I asked to see a loading schedule, it was under review. But the work, the real, physical work, couldn't hide. Ship after ship came through, and the same problems kept showing up. Cargo delays, weight imbalances, poor crate prep, no standard for waterproofing, basic stuff, fixable stuff, and no one was fixing it. I spoke up at the end of a morning briefing. You know we could cut turnaround time by 40% if we used the barrel frame floats for mid-bay transfers, right? Parsons looked up slowly, pencil still tapping. Reeves, with all due respect, no one here is drowning. I said it plain. Yet. That got me removed from the meeting. Work that spoke without my name on it. So I did what I always did. I went around them. I found the night crew, the guys who ran the forklifts and ran on caffeine and bad knees. I showed them how to brace barrels tighter, how to wrap crates in layered tarps, how to add flotation panels in 10 minutes using scrap they were throwing away. I never gave a speech, just showed up, rolled up sleeves, and worked. Word started to spread, not from the officers, from the dock floor, from the guys who'd seen things tip, crack, sink. They didn't care about politics. They cared about getting home. Then came the sabotage. It was subtle. First, a wrench missing. Then my barrel prototype misplaced. A pile of scrap I'd organized for the new test setup was suddenly cleared out. Routine cleanup, they said. I didn't blow up. Didn't file a complaint. I just looked around and realized something. The resistance wasn't coming from the top anymore. It was coming from around me. Folks afraid of losing control. Afraid that if my stuff worked, their years of knowing better would be worth less than a box of wet nails. The night it all came to a head. One night we were prepping a special outbound unit. Urgent convoy headed for the North Atlantic. Forecast said rough weather, real rough. But the loading plan was a mess, top-heavy cargo. No flotation, no secondary lash points. I went straight to Parsons. You send that out like this, it's gonna flip. He didn't look up. Noted. I leaned in. Noted's what you write when you already know it's wrong. But you're still doing it anyway. He stood up. This isn't your command, Reeves. You've made that clear. If you've got something to say, write it up and file it. Otherwise, stay in your lane. I didn't write it up. I wrote to the quartermaster himself. 2 pages. Straight facts. Attached photos. Annotated loadouts. I sent it that night. And that, right there, that letter, was the real line. You don't get to sit down after that next morning. I wasn't on the schedule. My name wasn't on the rotation board. Nobody talked to me. The silence wasn't cold. It was strategic. Like a group decision had been made without a vote. I wasn't surprised, just disappointed. Not because they iced me out, but because they were more scared of being wrong than of people getting hurt. And that, my friend, is what kills in a war. Not bullets, not bombs. Ego. The one man who stood up that afternoon, I was packing my things when Eddie walked in. Yeah, Eddie. Turns out they'd pulled him from Charleston the week before, reassigned him without a word, dropped him into night shift like he wouldn't be seen. They figured if we were apart we'd shut up. He smiled. Guess they forgot who taught me to weld sideways on a moving dock. He handed me a sheet. It was a revised load plan. Barrel integration, layered waterproofing, dynamic weight shift design. No name signed at the bottom. Just a note. They're running it quietly through Baltimore next week. Someone had to get it there. You hear that? That's the sound of change starting to move. Not with fireworks, not with permission, but with steady hands doing the work anyway. Stick around. Chapter 6 brings the reckoning. Let me tell you something plain and simple. Some wins don't look like wins. They don't come with medals. They don't show up in parades. Sometimes they come in the form of a quiet confirmation, a loading dock running smoother than usual, a name left off a reprimand, a report stamped approved without a signature. That's how I knew we'd done it. Not because someone told me, but because the people who used to block the door left it open. It started in Baltimore. No fanfare, no announcement, just a convoy. 5 ships headed to the North Atlantic with tight scheduling and tight nerves. But this time things were different. I wasn't even there. Eddie was. He said they loaded those ships in half the usual time. Without yelling, without dropping crates, without forklifts tipping like drunk dogs. Why? Because they were using our system. Barrel-based float buffers, quick-latch modular straps, improvised flotation built from scraps they used to throw out. Nobody called it the Reeves method. Of course not. But I knew. And so did every man on that night crew who used to work shoulder to shoulder with me in Depot 17. The officer who pretended he didn't know me. 2 weeks later, I was called back to Wilmington. Not to lecture, not to explain, just to subserve operations. Parsons was still there, still stiff as rebar, but this time he didn't avoid eye contact, didn't scold, didn't ignore. He shook my hand, didn't say much, just one sentence that stuck. Things are moving smoother now. Appreciate the improvements. Improvements. Not your idea, not your plan. But I took it, because I didn't need the words. I had the result. A message that didn't come through the chain. I was cleaning up my quarters that night when Eddie came in. He had a folded note. No stamp, no header, just 6 words handwritten. Keep the prints. Keep your head. He didn't know who left it, neither did I. But I knew what it meant. Somebody higher up saw what happened, saw that we weren't bluffing, saw that when it came to real logistics, real innovation, and real lives, we weren't just guessing. We were building, and they weren't going to stop us now. They were going to let it happen. Quietly, but fully. The cargo that made it back. Weeks later, I got word that all 5 ships from that convoy had made it. Rough weather, enemy threat, full payloads. Every single one arrived with less than 2% supply loss. A record at the time. No flooded decks, no busted crates, no lost containers. You know what that means. That means men ate who weren't supposed to. That means artillery had shells that would have rusted. That means fuel burned in engines, not in salt water. That's the part nobody writes in the papers. That's the stuff that saves lives without ever pulling a trigger. The day the wall came down. Just a little. Weeks after that, I found myself back in Norfolk. Different post, different crew, same concrete yard I'd stood on when they first told me. You're just a builder. But this time, they asked for my opinion, pulled me into planning sessions, started a new experimental integration team, and handed me a badge for it. Still no fancy title, still no brass band. But they gave me a table, and when I pulled out the blueprints, nobody tried to take them away. Eddie's last words before shipping out. Eddie got orders. Europe, frontline logistics. We sat one last time at the edge of a dock, watching the cranes move like clockwork, because now they had a plan worth following. He leaned back and said, "You know, when I got here, I thought this whole thing was going to chew us up and spit us out." I nodded. "It tried," he grinned. "Guess we just didn't taste right." The victory that wore work boots. Look, I didn't end the war. I didn't invent a new engine or unlock some classified code. I built a system. I saw where men were being sent out without the tools they needed, and I gave them a better shot at coming back. That was my war. That was my win. They still don't say my name at ceremonies, but every time a modular cargo float hits the water, every time a ship uses a barrel buffer or a welded frame brace, I'm there. In steel, in sweat, in silence that saves. Final words. They thought they were sending me away when they reassigned me. They thought they were punishing me when they took my name off the rotation. But what they really did was give me the space to build something they couldn't unbuild. Something that worked. Something that floated. If this story hits something in you, share it. Let it live. Because there are builders everywhere being told to stay in their lane. And sometimes they're the only ones keeping the whole damn thing afloat.